Hi, I wanted to give a brief debrief coming out of our first week's discussion with regards to SIFL and whether they should go to the United States, the United Kingdom, or some other Asian market. We had a really good discussion. Many of you made some excellent points. So therefore, I wanted to just kind of summarize some of the things that we can draw from that whole discussion, because I realize that maybe not all of you stayed with the discussion until the very end, and so therefore I want to make sure that we get some learning points out of that. So, really, the first week's discussion was kind of revolving around how do we really evaluate markets, market evaluation. So, a company is faced with the decision of where do we want to export our product, which market is the best market. And so one of the ways that we look at it is from an economic standpoint. So from an economic standpoint, I kind of like to look at this from a matter of almost like a profit equation, where you look at what revenues can you get, but what expenses do you need to have in order to gain those revenues. If it's really expensive to get those revenues, ultimately your profit is not going to be very high. So when you think of it in terms of the revenue standpoint, well, the very first thing to think about is the market size. And many of you did that. Many of you kind of thought about, well, how many Indians do we have in the United States relative to the United Kingdom and other places? And really what you were talking about is market size. And so there's some things that affect market size. The demographics, how many Indians are there? That's one example. So you have your customer profile, and you just look for these different markets or in these different countries, and you look for a significant number of people who match that customer profile, then you think that would be a more attractive market. However, there are some other things. There are economic variables, which really kind of pertain to the level of income the consumers might have. And whether that income is such that they can maybe afford your product, or what percentage of their annual income does your product happen to make up. If you're a high-end product and you're going to India, for example, if we were to do this in reverse, while India has a large population, but a significant number of those people do not have financial means to pay for high-class products, for example. And so therefore, while the total population of India is rather large, from an economic standpoint, the number of people who are able and perhaps willing to buy your product may be significantly smaller relative to a country with a smaller population. Also, we didn't really talk about this in our discussion, so therefore I wanted to highlight it, is growth potential of the market. Some companies may choose a smaller market over a larger one because of the growth potential in that smaller market, thinking that one market is growing much faster than another, and so therefore to get into that market early may be a better thing. So in addition to, when we're thinking about our revenues and the potential for us to gain revenues, in addition to market size, as our discussion pointed out, we also have to kind of think about competition. So in the United States market, in our discussion, there were some existing competitors there that might make the U.S. market a little bit less attractive, and those are powerful competitors. Nestle, Kraft, Unilever is here. So those large multinational food companies are competitors that we at least have to recognize that they have a strong hold of the market. They have well-established distribution systems and supply chain and well-established brands, and so it's going to be hard for SIFL to go in there and compete against such large competitors. So that's something that might detract from the revenues that they might receive otherwise. But then in addition to the revenues, we also have to kind of consider the expenses. And there are some expenses that we did discuss in our discussion, but that were brought up, but there are some others that I want us to make sure that we kind of consider. So first of all, trade barriers. And by trade barriers, maybe there are lack of trade barriers. Like, for example, there may be some trade agreements between countries, and so therefore that might make it more attractive. But if we have tariffs or some kind of non-tariff barrier, that may make it more expensive for us to do business in that country. Regulations, I mentioned in our discussion about the FDA here in America, that they may have some packaging regulations that may add costs to our product, which might, of course, decrease our profits. Logistics, as I mentioned in our discussion, yeah, sure, the United States is a large market, but it's also spread out over thousands of miles. And so to capture all the Indian market, you may have to sell your product in New York, Houston, LA, Miami, Chicago, Seattle, so all those places, and to physically get your product there and to promote your product in all those markets gets expensive. And speaking of promotional costs, some countries, the promotional costs are rather high to cover the entire country. Here in America, if you're going to try and cover the entire country, yes, you can use the internet, but you're also probably going to have to use mass media, television, radio, things like that. And when you are trying to cover such a large market, the cost for those media increases. Whereas if you're in a smaller market and that market relies more on print advertising or outdoor advertising, those costs are lower. And then finally, another expense side of the economic equation is the currency. And so the relative values of the currency and whether we expect those to appreciate or depreciate relative to each other, that actually may increase or decrease your profits, however the case might be. But in addition to economics, there are other things that we have to consider. There are other considerations that might make a market more attractive. For example, one of the things that we talked about was the cultural similarity. Between our market, our home market, and our potential host market or export market. Some of you have mentioned really well the fact that the UK and India has a historical cultural connection there that might make it a little bit more attractive to go to the United Kingdom because of those cultural similarities, the history that they have. The concept of being made in also is something to kind of consider. For example, let's just assume that in the UK, the consumers in the UK are a little bit more willing to accept Indian products, probably because of the history that they've had. Whereas maybe, for example, let's just assume that perhaps here in America, people may be more leery of products from India. They may not be, we might question the quality or the trustworthiness of a company, just simply because we haven't had much experience with Indian companies. And so therefore, that cultural similarity, their tastes, the spices that they use in their foods are very different than what we have here in America. And so that may make things a little bit more difficult for SIFL to come to America. There's also just simply one other thing a couple of other things I want us to consider is our company's experience. So the company's experience in a country will in fact impact the attractiveness of that country. So, for example, or that area for that matter, if you're already exporting. So, Oklahoma Christian, we've been for over 10 years. We've had a great relationship with Rwanda, and several of you are there in Kigali, and it's blessed to have you as our students. And so if Oklahoma Christian said, well, where else could we export our educational product? Well, since we have that experience in East Africa, then it may be more likely for us to go to another East African country. In fact, when I was there in May for graduation, I actually spoke to a gentleman from Uganda who is a member of parliament from the Jinja region in Uganda. He was kind of interested in perhaps Oklahoma Christian doing the same thing in Jinja or Kampala that we are doing in Kigali. And so therefore, since we've had that East African experience and knowledge from the Rwandan market, though different, it might translate a little bit better in Uganda than if we were to, say, try to go down to Latin America. Let's just say we go down to Venezuela or something like that. We have no experience in Venezuela. We don't know anything about the Latin American market. It would be a little bit more difficult because we don't have connections. We don't know the market. And so therefore, Venezuela would be a little bit less attractive than perhaps Uganda or Kenya or something like that. Speaking of Venezuela, the other thing we want to think about is political stability in a market. Markets become very unattractive if you might think that in a month or a year from now, things get really rocky as far as political stability is concerned. Right now in Venezuela, it's an ugly market. The Venezuelan market has nationalized many of the industries to try and better control that, and it's led to some foreign companies losing their assets. It's just led to economic chaos, quite honestly. And so therefore, companies that were doing business in Venezuela are trying to get out. And so you kind of have to think about political stability as a factor, because that will influence your ability to do business. So one other thing that we didn't talk about, and I want to bring up, is this concept of competitive posturing. And so in one of the questions that I had that really no one addressed was, so let's say Seifel is going to come to America. And we know that there are existing strong competitors. There's Nestle, there's Kraft, there's Unilever, there's others. And so what kind of competitive positioning or posturing, what kind of competitive posture does Seifel want to have? And I gave us three options. I said they could attack, which simply means they're going to go head on with Kraft, with Nestle, and they're going to try and just simply beat them at their own game. They could try and avoid them. And if they're going to avoid Kraft or Nestle, then what they're going to try and do is go to some places where either Kraft or Nestle just simply aren't trying to market very much. Those may be the smaller rural areas of America, or maybe they just chose not to come to America at all. So that's one way to avoid them. So they go to maybe other Asian nations, as an example. Or they can cooperate. And if they cooperate, a lot of people don't kind of consider this one. So if they were to come to America, this may be a very viable option for several reasons. One, Nestle and Kraft have well-established connections through the distribution channel. They have relationships with wholesalers. They have relationships with retailers. They have a strong brand name that the American market knows and trusts, right? And so therefore, Seifel might want to go to the likes of Kraft or Nestle and say, we have a very unique product. We have a product that has Indian spices and helps people prepare Indian food. And so therefore, maybe perhaps in Nestle's product portfolio, or let's just take Nestle, for example. Let's say Nestle's product portfolio doesn't really include an Indian type of product. Well, Seifel can give them automatically that product. And so therefore, what they might do is partner with Nestle and say, we're going to come into the American market. We have a good product. You use your existing brand name, Nestle, and perhaps Seifel becomes a brand name under that, just part of this joint venture or some kind of other cooperative agreement. And Nestle gets to market Seifel products in America. And so therefore, now they're cooperating. Nestle picks up some sales. Seifel basically sells to Nestle, or they share the profits or whatever it might be. And so there could be a win-win situation there for both those companies. A situation that a lot of people don't think. A lot of people just think, oh, we have to do it all on our own and establish our own market and therefore attack our competitors. But often there may be some cooperative opportunities. So just some things that I wanted us to get from the discussion. I look forward to our discussion this week with regards to Mattel's Barbie and other type of play dolls that are in the markets and the cultural influences on the marketing of that. So look forward to this discussion this week. Thanks.